Now, when I was asked to do this presentation, I sent 5 possible topics to your tutors. And to my surprise, in a way, they chose this one, which actually was at the bottom of the list, but they chose this one. Professions Sacred and Profane, Reflections upon the Changing Nature of Professionalism. And therefore, because it's slightly different from other things that I've written, I need to explain just a little bit of the background to it. I had an invitation from a Brazilian university, a secular university, where they have sent a professor to the institute to be a liaison person between Brazil and the institute. And this professor came and visited me and said, would I be prepared to do 2 lectures on the ethics of business and corporate activity for the School of Business Studies in this Brazilian university? And I said, well, really, I don't know that I'm the person to do this, because if you check anything I've written that has anything to do with the world of business and modern enterprise, you'll find it's nearly always strongly critical. And is that what your staff and students want to hear? He said, we do. He said, we realize that we have not, so he should, we realize that we have not paid enough attention to ethics in our business studies. And I thought, yes, and the present state of the world demonstrates the consequence of your not having done that. So, what makes this paper somewhat unusual in my collected works, we might say, is that I had to frame it as if I was addressing an audience, because I was televised as now to do this lecture, of people whose primary interest was going to be in the business, enterprise, finance area. So allow for that. But there are many things in it, of course, which are clearly relevant to those of us who are missionaries in education. So I hope you'll see the connections there. I do have to say also, as a preliminary, that I composed all this before I had the advantage of reading this book, written by Dr. John Lydon, one of your tutors, which I must say is an extremely fine book. And if you are seriously inspired to pursue the idea of the vocation of teaching, as opposed to the job of teaching, then you will certainly want to consult this book. It is his doctorate, which I had the pleasure of examining, and it's beautifully produced, as you see, with, of course, his great mentor there, Don Bosco, well presented, and I strongly recommend that to you. Unfortunately, I will not be referring to it in this paper, because I have written this paper before this book, but this book you really should study. A, because it's a wonderful example of a very good doctorate, and if you're thinking, after this MA, I'm thinking of a doctorate, then here's a very fine model of it. And of course, it brings out in much more Catholic detail the whole idea of the vocation of being a teacher. So I strongly recommend that. Okay, so let us begin. Now, you've all got a copy of my handout, and you've got that for 2 reasons. The first is that in these sessions, we can never cover all the material that is relevant to the subject, so you must regard that handout as your study material, and I think I might even say your obligatory homework, right? Because we shall not cover everything. The second reason you've got it is because, influenced as I am, of course, by our present Secretary of State, Mr. Michael Gove, and his wish to return all our teaching methods to how they were in the 1950s, naturally, I want to show cooperation with this great project of his. If we want to return to a pedagogy of the 1950s, then we will have to engage in a little reading around the class. So this means that at any moment I could point to any one of you and say, please read the next paragraph. This is not a joke, it will happen. So I give you warning, and I hope to get some credit points from Mr. Gove when he hears that I've been propagating this practice, which he would obviously think is an educational advance. So let's begin then by my outlining, first of all, the general framework of this presentation, and then we'll get into the detail of it. So in this lecture, I'm going to be, and you won't find this initial statement I'm making, which is a sort of preface, it's not yet in your paper. In this lecture, I will be examining the nature of and the need for professional ethics in the world of international business, trade, finance and banking, and of course, in the world of education. In order to do this, we must first understand what a profession and the concept of professionalism actually means. And to do that, we have to look at some of the history relating to the development of the ideas of professionalism as they evolved in Europe from the Middle Ages to the present age of global marketization. Now, I know that as modern students living in the modern age, you will be thinking, why do we need to know about this history? It is yesterday's story, and we want to hear about today's story. Actually, this could be your very own students in class saying this to you. If you ever try to make a historical reference, do we need this? Old stuff. This is such a major mistake. It's a major intellectual mistake, because there is no way one can begin to understand why the present is as it is if we have no grasp of the history of how it evolved to where it is. So any course of study that tries to remove a sense of the history of something is literally superficial. You cannot understand what someone's called the vivid present by just being in the vivid present. You have to have this historical setting in which you locate the vivid present, and then you've got a real grasp of why things are as they are. So I'm going to use as one of my major sources then for this theme, professions sacred and profane, the classic study of the professions and professionalism written by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim in the 19th century in this book entitled Professional Ethics and Civic Morals. It's a set of his lectures that he delivered in Bordeaux in France in the late 19th century, and it has some very sharp insights into the nature of professionalism. And of course, as a brilliant sociologist, he does it by studying how it changed historically across two great periods. And then I've added another period, our present time. So that is one great source. And the other source I will use to understand our present situation, remember, in what I called the culture of global marketization. That's where we are now. All your professional activity is located now, whether you like it or not, in the culture of global marketization. It's the dominant framework in which we are all located. To understand that, you will need to consult at some point the great 3-volume work, which I hope may be in the library here at St. Mary's University, of the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells. He has written these 3 great volumes. This great work is called The Information Age: Economy, Society, and Culture. The Information Age, Economy, Society, and Culture, and he published it, the 3 volumes, between 1996 and 1998. Okay, so that's the framework. So let's turn to the paper itself, to the introduction there. I'm saying the argument of this paper, and we are on text now, is that professions and professionals have a crucial role in society, which is to speak truth to power. Remember that next time you meet an Ofsted inspector. That's power. That's state power that's come in to survey what you're doing. But you're a professional, so you shouldn't cower in the presence of this reconstituted inquisition. You should have the proper dignity of a profession, and you should be prepared to speak truth to power. That is at the essence, I think, of what a professional should be. Someone who will speak truth to power. And this was one of the roles of the first professions of priesthood, medicine, and law. But today, the evidence suggests that professionalism is being reduced in scope to the demonstration of technical expertise and efficient performativity only. I don't know if you've come across this rather jargonistic word, but it's much used now in contemporary writing, performativity, which implies that a person shall be assessed and judged by what they deliver, what is visible and measurable, their performance, performativity, that's how they will be assessed. And when you think about a lot of the things that a teacher does in the formation of young people, a lot of these very important things, like their spirituality, their character, the values they have, the morals they have, these are not easily subject to a delivery assessment. They're not concrete or easily measurable. And the great danger in a performativity culture, which is what we've increasingly got, is that they can be marginalized because of the difficulty of assessing what you are accomplishing in these more intangible areas. So historically, professionalism, as Durkheim argues, involved the demonstration of esoteric knowledge and expertise. Certainly, you couldn't be a professional if you didn't have esoteric knowledge that most of the population won't have, and you have particular expertise that most of the population will not have. But also, in its origins, to be a professional was to have a commitment to codes of moral, ethical, and social conduct. So it's not just a technical function. And having these commitments, moral, ethical, and social, caused, and always has caused, some professionals to be critical of, or even oppose, policies introduced by powerful authorities. And so here is such a person. Here we have the patron saint of statesmen and politicians. Here we have the patron saint of lawyers. He was a distinguished lawyer. But the Vatican could well have, and probably should have, made him the patron saint of professionals, because he was a great professional. And did he not speak truth to power? Classic example. But I must remind you what happened to it. Bear that in mind. Okay. So I'm going to develop this analysis then in 3 sections. First, I'm going to look at the origin of the professions in the Middle Ages in what I shall call, I think quite properly, the culture of the sacred. In section 2, I will observe the transition of professionalism from the culture of the sacred, I'm using the terms that Durkheim uses, to the culture of the profane by the 19th century, and I will draw particularly on Durkheim's classic text on that subject. But in section 3, I will look at the contemporary situation of professionalism with special reference to those professionals who work in the fields of economics, finance, banking, and business studies, and also those who work in the field of education. This section will focus then on professionalism in the culture of global marketization. Now, please don't think, oh yes, okay, so he devised this lecture originally to speak to staff and students in a business school, so I can tune out when it's all about the business, because I'm not in that world. You'd be totally mistaken to do that. All those persons who are currently involved in corporate business, finance, trade, and business administration, they were all formed in a school. So you're going to be forming people who will go into that world. And so there's a very clear organic connection between what we do in education and what sort of persons go into the business and corporate world and how they act in it. It can sometimes be a bit sobering, though, when we do reflect on that connection. Because I remember talking to a person who was from the Philippines. And in the Philippines, the great majority of the population, substantial majority, are educated in Catholic schools, where they receive not only the spiritual and theological teaching of the Catholic Church, but its moral and social and ethical principles. The Philippines is nearly at the top of the world listing of the most corrupt states in the world. Now, there's something to stop you short. They've all had a Catholic education. It's a very corrupt society. We would call this a major contradiction. And so I commissioned someone to write in the journal, which Dr. Fincher mentioned earlier. We fortunately have on our editorial board Dr. Angelina Gutierrez of St. Scholastica's College in Manila. And I wrote her and said, now then, Angelina, here's a little challenge for you. How from this nearly 100% Catholic educated country can come a ranking of one of the most corrupt societies in the world? Would you like to investigate that? I expected her to say, no, thank you, or not without a major research grant. She took it on. So if you look at one of the past issues of the journal, you will find that she tries to probe that by interviewing a range of people in the Philippines as to how is it that if we've been formed ethically, morally, socially, spiritually, within the culture of Catholicism, our society is still one of the most corrupt in the world. So have a look at that article. It's only a beginning investigation, but it's so important. So let's look then at the position of professionals in the culture of the sacred, and I would date that approximately, since we ought to put historical period on it, from say, it's approximate, from say the 10th century to the 17th. Between the 10th and the 17th century, we can say that the whole of European culture was permeated by a real sense of the reality of the sacred, of the reality of a form of life beyond this, a sense of the transcendental. It was real for them, for nearly all of them. So it made a great culture in which they pursued their activities. And that was a very powerful formative influence for them. So it's the very idea, from that period comes this very idea of a profession being a calling. It's a calling. It's not simply a job. And professionalism, again, is not simply a way of pursuing a job, it's a process and a way of life. And it had its origins very clearly in religion, as Durkheim argues. What's particularly interesting about that is Durkheim himself was a secular Jew. So he was not a believing Catholic. This has come out of his religious belief. He was a secular Jew. But he saw perfectly well, historically, that the whole idea of profession as a calling came out of the hegemony of Catholic Christian culture in Europe and, of course, in France, which is where he lived. So we can say professionalism itself was formed in the religious culture and habitus established by the hegemony of the Catholic Church. And as I've already said, the first professions were priesthood. I should say, of course, priesthood and the religious life, obviously. But we must remember when we say that the priests and the nuns of medieval Europe were, of course, teachers. So in a way, if you're tracing our antecedents, that's where we all started. So when I was at Cambridge and had to wear a black gown all the time wherever I went, I felt I'd become a sort of priest by just having to wear this thing. And I remember at my college in Cambridge, I invited a Dominican preacher to come to one of our formal dinners. And he came wearing his white Dominican robes. And I said to him, "Oh, Father, it's expected that you have to wear this black gown before we go in for the formal dinner. The president of the college expects this." He looked at me, he said, "I don't want that gown," he said. "It's a 19th century copy of what I'm wearing. I have the original gown." So I thought, I can't beat that, and so he went in his white robe. Okay, so priesthood, medicine, and law then, they were shaped by that milieu of the sacred, whereby anything technical that they did had always a wider moral and ethical relation. And it could even on occasions have a political relation. So while they were certainly all under the command and jurisdiction of the temporal authorities of the time, the power that is, they always, and this was the mark of the professionals, they had another allegiance to the service of God, to revealed truth as taught by the church. They had a professional vocation. The priesthood existed to administer the sacraments and to witness to the truth. The physicians were called on to continue the work of the great physician, and the lawyers were called to administer the justice and mercy of God. So to be a professional in its historical origins was, at its best, to have this command of knowledge and competences, but always within a moral framework of service to the common good, guided by the teachings of religious faith. In other words, the notion of a calling, you are called to do something, gave to the early professions a relation to the sacred. Because the idea of the calling is the calling comes from God. You're called to do this. Now, over time, professionals such as physicians and lawyers began to form associations and organizations which codified the moral principles which ought to regulate professional behavior. And at another level, that of the various merchants and traders, guilds were established to regulate economic activity. The culture of the sacred, as mediated by the Catholic Church, shaped these forms of regulation, involving concepts such as the sanctity of life, service for the common good, and couldn't we do with bringing these concepts back? The just price and the just wage. The church was the regulator of these things. It brought an ethical and religious concern into the early world of the early capitalism that was emerging at the end of the Middle Ages. Think of that concept. Imagine going now into a meeting between unions and management, and the unions coming up with the idea, we are using this concept of the just wage, and we're telling you that what we're being paid at the moment is just not enough. And so we want you to have a moral concept to bring into our negotiations. Well, the management would think they'd gone mad, wouldn't they? This is completely outside the framework of secular thinking. So we lost something very important there. Okay, let's move on then to... Now, the problem I've got here is my text is not quite the same as yours. Could you move on to the section where it has the subheading Professionalism in the Culture of the Profane? But just above that, I'm talking about then this transition from the culture of the sacred to the culture of the profane, and it begins at the top of that section where it says, Durkheim saw this change, and it created, as I put there, a big intellectual challenge to him. Because although he was a secular Jew, he understood that it was that Catholic culture and all its associated concepts that kept social order in place and that established, if you like, some sense of the rule of a morality. And what was happening in the transition then, in this new age following what was called the Enlightenment, which is the time when many intellectuals started to question everything, including the existence of God and the teachings of the Catholic Church and so on, what would be the basis in the future, Durkheim was thinking, for any social solidarity? What would be the sources for moral education and moral regulation of anything in the future? It was, in Durkheim's view, a situation that he called potential anomie. Anomie is where there is no agreement about what is the norm of anything. It's everybody's opinion about what is right to do. And so it was because these questions preoccupied him that he delivered this set of lectures actually to students of education in France between 1890 and 1900, and I would say it's still a classic in its analysis of the development of professionalism. So that's the first sector then. We turn now to the second one, professionalism in the culture of the profane, and I will ask Dr. Lydon if he would kindly read that section.
In modern English discourse, the use of profane is often taken to mean that which treats something sacred in a hostile and abusive way. Durkheim used profane in a quite different way, i.e., in an objective and analytical sense, which referred to a major cultural change observable in Europe and particularly in France. This cultural change involved the end of the hegemony of the Catholic Church, of its Christian teachings and dogma, of the culture of the sacred, which it sustained, and of its associated values and practices. In its place, Durkheim observed, especially in France, the development of a profane culture, in which the dominant principles were reason, individualism, enterprise, and relative personal autonomy. Religion had retreated from its central role as regulator of social, economic, and political life to a minor role as guide to some believers in their private.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lydon. And I hope you all noted how he didn't hesitate for a moment. He was on task, on text, and the beautiful articulation of the words which he delivered to us, a fine example, which I'm sure you will all emulate, should I ask you to do the next reading. So I go on. This newly established profane culture, then, challenged Durkheim to consider in what ways social solidarity, social order, and forms of moral regulation of human behavior could be guaranteed in the future. And the problem was, as Durkheim expressed it, and this is a very powerful statement he's made, and a provocative one, and when we get round to discussion, you might want to say that Durkheim had an unduly critical view of human nature. This is what he says. It is not possible for a social function to exist without moral discipline. Otherwise, nothing remains but individual appetites. And since they are by nature boundless and insatiable, if there is nothing to control them, they will not be able to control themselves. And remember, that's not coming from a religious writer, that's coming from a secular Jew, and a very shrewd observer of society and of people within it. So I say there, recognizing that the church could no longer be the regulator of social and economic activity, Durkheim came to the view that this role had passed to the secular state, which he accepted would have to be the organ of moral discipline in profane culture. However, you see, he did see the necessity for the state in some sense to try to replace the church, but then there were problems in that. An all-powerful state, like an all-powerful church, might become an oppressive force in society. So other social institutions were required to achieve a situation of some balance of power. Institutions which in some senses could monitor the activities of the state. For Durkheim, these other social institutions would be found in the secular professional associations with their relative autonomy and codes of ethics. And as Turner is the editor of this text, puts it for Durkheim, this is Turner's concept on Durkheim's argument, but it catches it perfectly, I think. The real dislocation of modern society was the absence of intervening social institutions between the individual and the state. Occupational and professional associations were intended to fill this gap. And in this sense, professions and professionals had a potentially crucial political significance in society. In place of the church, which had, on occasions, resisted the power of kings, Durkheim believed that professional associations could provide a source of restraint upon secular governments in the future. Professions with their associated codes of ethics would also provide, in a secular mode, a continuation of moral education and moral regulation in the new cultural context. As Durkheim argued, the professional group is by no means incapable of being in itself a moral sphere, since this was its character in the past. So when you think about that, especially that quote from Turner, where he says the real dislocation of modern society was the absence of intervening social institutions between the individual and the state. And his hope, Durkheim's hope, was that occupational groups would be the intervening institution, because they would have a code of morality and ethics. It's a secular replacement for the church. So just consider the current policy favoured by Mr. Gove, which is to introduce the idea of schools being academies. And if all schools gradually become academies, they will sign an individual contract with the Secretary of State. The intervening social institutions that have existed up to the moment between a school and the Secretary of State have been called local education authorities. They are gradually being depowered, marginalized, and it is entirely clear that the intention of this academy policy is to remove them or render them very weakened. And so there will just be a direct relation then between the source of power, Secretary of State, you make the contract with the Secretary of State, and the school. Sends a chill up your spine, doesn't it, when you think about it? And you see how Durkheim, all those years ago, saw the danger of there being just the powerful state and then some small individual unit, and how there had to be something intervening to hold some sort of balance of power. And he wanted it to be the professions. But our system here has evolved also the professions, but the local education authority. And if they are to be weakened and marginalized, one needs to think about that. I recommend to you the article in the last edition of the journal Networking, Catholic Education Today, where, on my invitation, the distinguished educationist Sir Peter Newsom, the former Chief Education Officer of the ILEA, has written a piece in which he warns Catholic educators of the great danger that is likely to occur if all Catholic schools take the academy road. He calls it, rather dramatically, towards a totalitarian education system. And he's very worried that too much power is then placed in the hands of whoever may be the Secretary of State. Okay, so let's then move on to, because I'm conscious of the time going, let's move on to where I do those quotes from Durkheim. Unfortunately, my page numbers are not the same as yours. So do you see a series of quotes from Durkheim with bullet points? Yes. Now, look at how perceptive he was and how many of the things he said then apply now. Here, he's talking about the fact that once the medieval guilds, which did the moral regulation of commercial activity, were marginalized themselves in the new age of the profane, and the beginnings of a more secular age, he's considering, and he argues explicitly, that the world of enterprise and business then had no ethical or moral regulation. This was the beginning of early capitalism. It was shaking off any form of moral or ethical regulation. And he's saying, well, think about this. Look at what he says here. I wonder if I could ask, is Father Awesome here? Would you please read the bullet points from Durkheim?
This lack of organization in the business professions has one consequence of the greatest moment, which is that in this whole sphere of social life, no profession ethics exist.
Right, so let's just stop there. So, he's saying it's a big and growing area of our social life. It has no professional ethics to regulate it. Yes, Father, would you go on then, please?
You see, a moral character to economic life amounts of public danger.
And doesn't that resonate with our present world? Isn't what he said then being demonstrated now? Yes, please go on.
Clearly, if there has been self-delusion to this degree among the classical economics, it is because the economic functions were studied as if they were an end in themselves, without considering what further reaction they might have on the whole social order.
Okay, and the last one, Father?
The more the markets expand, the greater the urgency of some regulation to put an end to instability.
Thank you very much. All of those observations resonate with what is happening in our present world. He saw all this quite clearly. And so, if you follow after those bullet points, I'm saying there then that Durkheim had great hopes that the established professions would provide a moral and ethical environment for society which would compensate for the loss of the power of the sacred in social and economic life. And he put particular faith in the teaching profession in France, which he saw must be disseminating secular understandings of moral education in the schools of France. And as I've said it there, it could be said that for Durkheim, teachers in France were seen as a form of secular priests. He still wanted them to sort of have the status of a priest, but without an attachment to a religion. But he wanted it to have an attachment to a secular concept. What would have to replace the religious goals and understandings of life would be the great nation of France, its unity, its necessary unity, and its necessary importance, the national pride of being French. So, as I say it there, teachers were seen as a form of secular priests of rational moral education who would replace the former role undertaken by Catholic priests. But I conclude here, nevertheless, it seems likely that he knew that the work of schools alone would not compensate for the economic anomie and anarchy which characterize the sphere of capitalist enterprise growing ever stronger in France. Let's turn then to the last sector, professionals in the culture of global marketization. And I say there that just as Emile Durkheim was the theorist of those first two phases of the development of professionalism, the leading contemporary theorist and empirical researcher of today's culture of globalization is Manuel Castells. If you want to understand what is happening in the whole phenomenon of globalization today, you will need to dip into, because they are massive texts, and there are 3 of them, and they're full of theory, but loads and loads of empirical research. How he did it, I have no idea. It's an incredible achievement. Anyway, you will need to dip into the massive 3-volume studies, The Information Age, Economy, Society and Culture, and you will find there that Castells documents in detail the consequences of what he describes as the rise of the network society. And we'll look at the quote that I give from Castells, and I will ask, is Kate O'Brien here? Yes, would you kindly read that, Kate?
A new economy has emerged in the last 2 decades on a worldwide scale. I call it informational and global to identify its fundamental distinctive features. It is informational because the productivity and competitiveness of units or agents in this economy, be it firms, regions or nations, depend upon their capacity to generate, process and apply efficiently knowledge-based information. It is global because the core activities of production, consumption and circulation, as well as their components, capital, labour, raw materials, management, information, technology, markets, are organised on a global scale, and competition is played out in a global network of interaction. It has emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century because the information technology revolution provides the indispensable material basis for such a new economy.
Thank you very much, Kate. So that puts powerfully how the information technology revolution has changed our world. There will be those people listening to my address now who will be smiling inwardly by the fact that I never touch it myself, but that doesn't mean I don't understand its considerable significance. I just prefer to stay in my parallel universe. Castells goes on to argue that the cultural, social, and political consequences, it has all these consequences, cultural, social, and political consequences of this economic revolution are far-reaching, and international competitiveness has emerged as a key dynamic in every society. So is Maria Shepherd here? Would you kindly read the quote from Castells following?
Together with the search for profitability as the driving motivation of the firm, the informational economy is also shaped by the vested interest of political institutions in fostering the competitiveness of those economies they are supposed to represent. The emphasis here is on the relative position of national economies vis-à-vis other countries as a major legitimising force for governments. Practically all countries have to steer their economies in cooperation and in competition with others.
Thank you, Maria, for that. So that globalization phenomenon that we're living in has brought this hegemonic idea now that we have to constantly be comparing our performativity, what we achieve, what we're accomplishing, internationally. So it makes globalization like a total race that is getting faster and faster all the time. Actually, my 3 grandsons are always complaining to me about the intolerable burden of homework which they are receiving in their secondary schools. And they visit me quite frequently for some unpaid tutorial support, which ethically I sometimes wonder if I ought to be providing if I believe in equality of educational opportunity. But they are my grandsons and they're saying, can you help me? What can I do? And they say to me, why do we have to do all this? Our life is colonized by these constant assignments and problems. And I say to them, look, we are in a situation of globalization. International competitiveness is everywhere. Your schools are trying to drive you to go faster and faster in order that the Chinese and those in Singapore and Korea will not go faster than you. And you've got to keep up in this race. I say it, but I don't really believe it. You've got to keep up in this race if you want to get a position in the world that will be satisfying work for you. One of them said, couldn't we just be like the animals and sort of live off the country? He lives in the country. And I said, well, it's a lovely idea. I said, but I don't think it's practical. So, you see, all these great international movements, they're coming in and they're impacting on our students and on us, because the pressure is on us as well. So, that raises question about what then are professionals to do when they are in that situation. Okay, well, unfortunately, I've got to ask you then to move on in your paper, and I'm sorry I can't give you the exact page numbers, where the page begins or should have the statement, a similar development has been noted in the UK by Stephen Ball, Professor of Sociology, in his research-based book, Education PLC. Have you got that? Bottom of 7. Okay. So, our professor of the sociology of education at the Institute has brought out this very interesting book. I reviewed it. He's put a lot of research into this. It's significantly called Education PLC, Public Limited Company. And look at his conclusion. Within institutions, colleges, schools, and universities, the means-ends logic of education for economic competitiveness. And by the way, he demonstrates that this was advanced as much under new Labour governments as it is under the present coalition. So there's no escape. It's transforming what were complex interpersonal processes of teaching, learning, and research into a set of standardized and measurable products. Teachers both at school level and in higher education who in previous decades have been regarded as professionals involved in the intellectual, cultural, social, and moral development of children and young people are now being reconstructed as agents to service the economic needs of the competitive state. Ball argues that education is spoken of within policy in terms, it should say, of its economic value and its contribution to international market competitiveness. And listen to this chilling judgment from Ball. And a situation is developing in the UK in which these, sorry, that's a mistake. It should say, in which there will be a thorough subordination of moral obligations to economic ones. Knowledge itself is being reconstructed as a commodity in the marketplace which can be traded like any other commodity in the global economy. And then it goes on. All of these arguments have been anticipated by Ball's predecessor at the Institute of Education, Professor Basil Bernstein. In the prescient section of his text, Pedagogy, Symbolic Control, and Identity, Bernstein argued, actually quite interesting. Bernstein, he was my doctoral supervisor, brilliant man. a secular Jew. How interesting. And always very influenced by the work of Durkheim. Two secular Jews, both very perceptive of how the world was changing. Look at what he writes there. There is a new principle guiding the latest transition of capitalism. The principles of the market and its managers are more and more the managers of the policy and practices of education. Market relevance is becoming the key orientating criterion for the selection of discourses. So he's saying it even affects how we talk about education, the very words we use. This movement has profound implications from the primary school to the university. There is a new concept of knowledge. This new concept is a truly secular concept. Knowledge should flow like money to wherever it can create advantage and profit. Indeed, knowledge is not like money, it is money. Knowledge is divorced from persons, their commitments, their personal dedications. These become impediments. So, I have to stop there, but the point I would say there then is that given that I think this culture of global marketization with its international competitiveness, its performativity, its drive for more and more measurable products of what we do, grows stronger and stronger under whatever government comes to power, we have to think as Catholic educators that there has to be some source of resistance to what will become a totally dominating hegemony of these ideas. Because our commitments, if they are properly understood, cannot allow us simply to turn education into the production of useful workers, fast working workers for this competitive global economy. We will give them knowledge. We have an obligation. We will give them skills. We have an obligation. But we are trying to form good people. We are trying to bring them to a sense of their relation with the transcendent. We are trying to give them a sense of what it is to be an ethical and moral person. We are trying to give them a sense of how the fully mature, formed individual after education should have grasped the idea that your being in the world is meant to be one of service to the common good. Our formula, unlike the secular formula of globalization, is we give them the knowledge, we give them the skills, but we give them the sense that the knowledge and skills they have are not for their personal advantage only, but for the common good. That's the Catholic formula, and we must stick to it. Thank you very much.